Everett Hale thought inheriting 3,700 acres of untouched valley would mean silence, freedom, and a fresh beginning. Instead, he arrived to find survey stakes, bulldozers, and luxury signs advertising homes on land his family had owned for generations. At the center stood Marlene Voss, the HOA president. Everyone quietly called Karen, calmly claiming she had already sold 42 lots. She laughed at Everett's deed, called him a trespasser, and ordered deputies to remove him from his own property. But Marlene had overlooked one sealed boundary map, one missing signature, and one federal easement capable of turning her entire development into evidence of fraud overnight. Everett drove his old pickup truck into the Silverbriar Valley after more than 15 years away, following a phone call informing him that his uncle Franklin Hale had passed away and left him the entire valley. Franklin had lived almost as a recluse, refusing every offer from resort companies and mining outfits who wanted a piece of his land. In Everett's memory, the valley held nothing but open meadow pine forest, 2 creeks, and a stone house tucked beneath the mountain. When he finally crossed the old cattle gate, none of that memory matched what stood in front of him now. A freshly paved road cut straight through the meadow-orange survey stakes lined up in rows, and a massive billboard read, Silverbriar Estates exclusive mountain lot starting at $850,000. Excavators rumbled near a temporary sales office, and on a glossy marketing map, at least 42 parcels were already stamped sold. Everett stopped his truck beside a cluster of workers and asked who had authorized any of this. The site manager told him they worked for the Silverbriar Estates Homeowners Association and that every acre had been legally purchased years earlier. Everett calmly pulled out a copy of his uncle's will and the county-certified deed naming him as sole heir. The manager didn't believe a word of it and called Marlene Voss directly, and within 10 minutes, a white luxury SUV rolled up the new road. Marlene stepped out in a tailored blazer designer sunglasses and a thick folder clutched under one arm, looking Everett over as though he were a distant cousin trying to scrape together an inheritance claim. She announced that the Homeowners Association had controlled most of the valley for 6 years and that Franklin Hale retained nothing more than the stone house and a few surrounding acres. Everett asked to see the transfer documents, and Marlene produced a photocopy bearing what looked like Franklin's signature. One glance told Everett something was wrong because his uncle always signed in blue ink with a middle initial, and this signature was black ink with no initial at all. He said nothing about it yet, only warning her that before she sold another lot, she should make absolutely certain she actually owned it. Marlene laughed in his face and ordered him off her private community, and when he refused to leave, she called the sheriff's department and accused him of criminal trespassing on Homeowners Association property. 2 patrol cars rolled into the valley while Marlene stood with her arms crossed, fully expecting Everett to be handcuffed and dragged off the very land he had just inherited. Sheriff Grant Holloway climbed out first, along with a junior deputy, and Marlene wasted no time pointing at Everett and accusing him of breaking in, threatening workers, and interfering with a multi-million-dollar development. Everett stayed calm and handed Grant copies of the will, the deed, and the probate court's certification of ownership, and Grant examined every page carefully before turning to Marlene and asking for the association's own title. Documents. She produced the same photocopy she had shown Everett earlier, insisting the transfer had been signed 6 years prior and filed properly at the county land records office. Grant realized both parties were holding paperwork that looked legitimate on the surface, and without a court order, he refused to make any arrest. Marlene demanded he enforce the association's bylaws instead, and Grant flatly reminded her that homeowners association rules did not override state property law. In front of the workers and prospective buyers touring the site, Marlene declared loudly that Everett was a con artist and warned everyone not to believe a single word out of his mouth. Everett asked one simple question in return, wondering why the parcel numbers on her billboard didn't match the numbers recorded on his uncle's original deed. Marlene hesitated for the first time because the marketing map used a new numbering system the association had invented themselves. While Franklin's deed described the land using a decades-old federal survey system, she quickly claimed the numbers had simply been updated after the parcels were subdivided, but when Everett asked to see the county's official subdivision approval, she refused, insisting he had no right to demand it. Everett turned to Grant and explained that in Montana, subdividing a property this large into more than 40 separate lots required an environmental review infrastructure assessment and public hearing before county commissioners. Grant asked whether the association had ever obtained that approval, and Marlene claimed every relevant record sat in the office of Duncan Crowell, the county's land records supervisor. Grant allowed Everett to remain at the stone house, but ordered both sides to stand down until ownership could be properly verified through the courts. The moment the deputies drove away, Marlene ordered a temporary fence built across the private road leading up to the house, a petty gesture meant to remind Everett who she believed was really in charge. Everett returned to his truck, retrieved a survey-grade camera and handheld GPS unit, and spent the rest of the afternoon documenting every stake, every piece of equipment, and every serial number he could find near the construction site. Marlene mocked him from a distance, telling him that a handful of photographs could never defeat a homeowners association with millions of dollars and an entire team of lawyers behind it. Everett replied that he had no intention of defeating the association at all. He only needed to prove it had never owned the valley to begin with. That night, walking the northern boundary with a flashlight, Everett found one of the new survey stakes driven directly through an old stone marker, dating back to 1912, and buried just beneath the disturbed soil, he uncovered a silamen, faded metal disc, stamped with the seal of the Federal Land Management Bureau. Grant stood beside his patrol car for a long moment after Marlene's SUV disappeared down the new road, watching Everett quietly gather his documents without a trace of anger on his face. He had seen plenty of property disputes over the years, but something about the composure in Everett's voice told him this one ran deeper than a simple family disagreement. Before leaving, Grant warned Everett that Marlene had a reputation throughout the county for winning fights through sheer volume rather than through paperwork. He advised Everett to document everything, keep copies in more than one place, and never assume the county's own records were beyond question. Everett thanked him and said that was exactly the plan he already had in mind. Everett spent the rest of that night walking the old boundary lines with a flashlight and a printed copy of the original survey coordinates his uncle had once shown him as a boy. He located 7 separate stakes the association had driven into the ground, each one shifted anywhere from 300 to over 900 feet from the true property line. None of the shifts were random, because every single one pushed the boundary deeper into land that had always belonged to the Hale family. Back inside the stone house, Everett searched Franklin's old study and found most of the drawers emptied, a locked cabinet pried open, and file boxes sitting completely hollow. Someone had clearly gone through the house before Everett had ever arrived. Behind an old landscape painting hanging crooked on the wall, Everett discovered an envelope addressed to a man named Nolan Mercer, and inside it was a photograph of Franklin standing beside Nolan next to one of the original boundary markers. On the back, in Franklin's own handwriting, was a warning that read, "Do not trust the new map, the eastern line has never moved." Everett tracked down Nolan Mercer, a retired land surveyor, living roughly an hour outside the valley, and at first the old man refused to say much, wary of being dragged into a fight with a powerful homeowners association. But once he learned Franklin had passed away, Nolan finally opened up and admitted that 6 years earlier Marlene had personally hired him to survey the eastern section of the valley. Nolan's own survey concluded, the association legally controlled only about 84 acres near the main road, nowhere close to the entire valley. Marlene now claimed as her development. He recalled Marlene asking him to redraw an old hiking trail as if it were an official legal boundary, and when he refused, he walked away from the contract entirely. Months later, a different survey map surfaced bearing what looked disturbingly close to his professional seal. Though Nolan swore he had never signed off on any such document. He still had his original field notes locked away, but he knew they wouldn't be enough on their own if the county's official records had already been altered to match Marlene's version of events. When Everett asked who could possibly change official land records, Nolan gave him one name without hesitation, Duncan Crowell. Nolan poured 2 cups of coffee and admitted he had carried a quiet guilt for years, wondering whether his refusal to alter the survey had somehow made things worse for Franklin rather than better. He explained that after he walked away from the contract, Marlene never approached him again, which he now realized meant she had simply found someone more willing to cooperate. He described Franklin as stubborn but fair, a man who had personally walked every fence line with him during the original survey and who knew the valley's terrain better than anyone else alive. Nolan still had his field notebook stored in a fireproof cabinet in his garage, filled with handwritten coordinates, elevation readings, and dated photographs that no fabricated map could easily replicate. He offered to testify if it ever came to that, telling Everett that a lie this large eventually collapses under its own weight. It just needed someone patient enough to keep pulling at the threads. While Everett met with Nolan, Marlene called an emergency meeting with everyone who had purchased a lot, insisting Everett was attempting to extort the association and promising the project would continue exactly as planned. A few buyers grew visibly uneasy since many had paid between $600,000 and well over $1 million for their parcels without ever receiving an individual deed. Marlene assured them the paperwork was simply moving through processing, though in reality the money had already been funneled into accounts controlled by Victor Langford's development company. Everett and Nolan returned to the valley to remeasure key boundary points and found that one of the original stone markers had been torn from the ground with heavy equipment and buried beneath a mound of loose dirt. As Nolan raised his phone to photograph the disturbed site, a dump truck suddenly appeared and deliberately released a load of gravel directly over the exposed evidence. Everett stepped in front of the machinery, forcing the driver to stop before the marker was completely buried, and moments later Marlene arrived, declaring that no survey work could take place without prior authorization from the Association. Everett held up his phone, showing her the clear image of the federal boundary seal he had photographed the night before, and for the first time since he'd met her, the confidence on Marlene's face visibly cracked. She turned away quickly, pulled out her phone and made a call that Everett happened to overhear just enough of. She told someone named Victor that Everett had found the marker, and that they needed to get inside the stone house and retrieve the old maps before he found them first. Everett had already noticed signs that someone had broken into the stone house earlier, so he installed small cameras at the entrance, the study, and the equipment shed before nightfall. He also reached out to Tessa Whitmore, an attorney who specialized in fraudulent deeds and elder property theft, sending her copies of everything he had gathered so far. Tessa reviewed Marlene's contract within hours and immediately flagged several glaring inconsistencies that a careless forger had failed to hide. The signing date on the deed placed Franklin at a notary's office on a day when hospital records showed he was undergoing treatment 300 miles away. The notary listed on the document had actually passed away nearly a year before the paperwork was supposedly signed, and the filing number followed a format the county hadn't started using until 2 years after the alleged transaction. Tessa concluded this wasn't a simple clerical mistake, but likely evidence of an organized real estate fraud scheme reaching well beyond one greedy HOA president. She had spent nearly a decade fighting cases exactly like this one, watching elderly landowners and unsuspecting heirs lose property to associations and developers who counted on nobody ever reading the fine print closely enough. What made this case unusual, she told Everett, was the sheer scale of it. Dozens of families and tens of millions of dollars tangled together with a piece of federally protected land that nobody involved seemed to fully understand the danger of touching. She warned him that people who build empires on forged paperwork rarely go down quietly, and that Marlene would likely escalate before she ever considered backing down. Everett said he wasn't interested in a quiet resolution anyway, only an honest one, and Tessa smiled for the first time since they'd met, telling him that was exactly the kind of client she preferred to represent. She advised Everett to avoid direct confrontation with Marlene and instead quietly petition the court for an emergency construction freeze while the deed's validity was investigated. That same night, the cameras caught 2 masked figures prying open the back door of the stone house, unaware that Everett was watching from the equipment shed nearby. Rather than confronting them directly, he called Grant, flooded the yard with exterior lighting, and remotely locked the electronic gate, sending both intruders running for their vehicle. The getaway car sped off, but not before the cameras clearly captured a logo belonging to Victor Langford's development company stamped across its door. Grant arrived to find fresh footprints, a pry bar left behind, and a duplicate key that didn't match any lock currently on the property. Inside, a hidden panel behind the study's wooden paneling had been forced open, though the intruders had only managed to grab an empty storage box. Everett had already found that box days earlier, and quietly handed its actual contents over to Tessa for safekeeping. Inside were letters between Franklin and a federal conservation office, revealing that 1,200 acres in the northern section of the valley were locked under a permanent conservation agreement. No one, not the association, not any developer, was legally permitted to subdivide, build on, or grade that protected land under any circumstance. 11 of the lots Marlene had already sold sat squarely inside that protected federal zone, meaning any discovery of the agreement wouldn't just stall the project, it could expose everyone involved to federal fraud charges. The following day, Marlene held a small press event outside the sales office, publicly accusing Everett of sabotaging equipment and intimidating investors to scare them off the property. Tessa arrived at Everett's side and handed Marlene a formal copy of a lawsuit that had just been filed on his behalf. Marlene scoffed, certain Everett could never afford to sustain a drawn-out legal battle against her resources, but Tessa calmly informed her that the court had already agreed to review an emergency motion. From that moment forward, the association was legally barred from closing a single additional sale until a formal hearing took place. Right after the press event ended, an elderly couple approached Everett and handed him their purchase agreement for a lot they had paid $920,000 for. The parcel number printed on their contract placed their future dream home entirely inside the federally protected conservation zone. Everett and Tessa began meeting individually with every buyer they could locate, eventually confirming that Marlene had sold a total of 42 separate lots to 36 different families. Altogether, deposits and payments collected from those buyers exceeded $28 million. And not one single buyer had ever received a legitimate recorded deed to their property. Instead, each family had only ever been given a reservation agreement, a homeowners association, membership contract, and an unstamped subdivision map, along with a vague promise that formal deeds would arrive once the roads were finished. Many of these buyers had sold their previous homes or drained retirement savings to make their payments, believing they were investing in a legitimate mountain community. Marlene tried to turn the victims against Everett, warning them he intended to shut down the entire project and leave them with nothing to show for their money. Everett refused to blame the buyers, explaining patiently that they too were casualties of the exact same scheme that had targeted his own family. Tessa traced the flow of every payment and discovered the funds had never been placed into the escrow account promised in each contract. Most of the money had instead been routed straight into Langford Development, then quietly scattered across 6 separate shell companies. A single payment of nearly $4 million had gone toward purchasing the private estate that Marlene now called home. Meanwhile, Duncan Crowell publicly insisted the county's official records confirmed the association's ownership, presenting a digital deed that had supposedly been filed 6 years earlier. When Tessa requested the original paper copy, Duncan claimed it had been destroyed after digitization, a direct violation of the county's own historical records retention policy. Everett visited the land records office himself and noticed the page containing Franklin's original transaction looked visibly reprinted with mismatched ink font and sequence numbers compared to the surrounding pages. He also uncovered an old handwritten ledger showing the filing number now assigned to the association's deed had originally belonged to an entirely different transaction, a water rights permit for a ranch nearly 70 miles away. The moment Everett asked to photograph that ledger, Duncan slammed the records room door shut and called for security. Tessa immediately filed an emergency evidence preservation request, with the court blocking Duncan from destroying anything further. In retaliation, Marlene imposed a $5,000 daily fine against Everett for what she called obstruction of association business, plastering a seizure notice across the gate of the stone house itself. Everett ripped the notice down, and standing in front of several buyers filming with their phones, said plainly that an association which owns no land cannot fine a landowner, and a person who sells what doesn't belong to them isn't a developer at all but a con artist. The clip spread quickly throughout the county, and public pressure mounted until Grant had no choice but to formally open a criminal investigation. That night, Nolan called Everett with a detail he had suddenly remembered. Franklin had once sealed the valley's original boundary map inside a fireproof box and hidden it beneath the abandoned pump station at the center of the property. Everett, Tessa, and Nolan arrived at the old pump station before sunrise, a forgotten structure Marlene intended to bulldoze for a private clubhouse. Beneath the cracked concrete floor, they found a rusted metal plate stamped with the initials F and H, and inside the fireproof box lay a stack of documents that would change everything. There was the original federal survey map from 1912, the authentic deed granting the entire valley to the Hale family, the signed federal conservation agreement, and Franklin's private journal, detailing every attempt Marlene had made to pressure him into selling. There was also a letter in which Franklin directly accused Marlene of forging his signature, along with results from a private handwriting analysis he had secretly commissioned before his death. The recovered map confirmed the association legally owned only 84 acres, sitting well outside the valley's true boundary, meaning every single one of the 42 lots Marlene had sold belonged to land she never owned in the first place. Nolan ran his fingers along the faded ink of the original survey, recognizing his own mentor's handwriting style from decades of training within the same regional office, confirming beyond doubt that the document was genuine. Tessa carefully photographed each page before sealing the originals inside a fresh evidence bag, aware that a single missing document could unravel months of careful legal work. Everett sat quietly on the concrete ledge of the old pump station holding his uncle's journal, reading entries that stretch back years describing quiet threats, late-night phone calls, and a persistent fear that no one in the county would ever believe an old man living alone. In one entry, Franklin had written that he no longer trusted the sheriff's office or the courthouse, and that the only people he trusted with the truth were the mountains themselves. Reading those words, Everett finally understood why his uncle had chosen to hide the evidence rather than simply hand it over to authorities who might already be compromised. Before the three of them could leave the pump station, an excavator suddenly rolled up its operator, claiming he'd received orders to demolish the unsafe structure immediately. Everett stood directly in the machine's path while Tessa called the sheriff's department and Nolan filmed the entire confrontation on his phone. Marlene arrived minutes later, insisting the pump station fell within the project's boundaries and demanding Everett hand over the box at once. When she attempted to physically grab it from him, Tessa intervened, warning her that tampering with evidence already subject to a court preservation order could constitute obstruction of justice. Grant arrived with backup deputies and ordered the excavator operator to power down immediately, and when Grant asked who had authorized the demolition, the site manager produced a direct text message from Victor Langford. Grant confiscated the phone and equipment as evidence, and Tessa immediately submitted the recovered map and original deed to the court. Judge Rebecca Sloan issued an emergency order halting all construction, freezing every account tied to the association and Langford Development, barring any transfer of related assets, and demanding the county surrender its complete land records for review. Marlene still insisted Everett's map was fabricated and vowed to prove the Hale family had abandoned their claim to the valley years earlier. Tessa recognized this as the beginning of a new legal strategy, an argument based on long-term adverse possession, which would require Marlene to prove continuous open use of the land, along with consistent tax payments and no objection from the true owner. Franklin, however, had paid property taxes on the entire valley every single year, without exception, and Everett found every receipt neatly filed inside the recovered box. When Grant later reviewed the site manager's confiscated phone, he found a text exchange between Victor and Marlene that read, "If the court sees the real tax records, Duncan takes all of us down with him." Word of the upcoming hearing spread quickly through the valley in the days beforehand, and buyers who had once trusted Marlene completely now found themselves whispering doubts to one another outside the sales office. Some still clung to hope that the entire dispute was simply a misunderstanding between two feuding relatives unwilling to accept that the community they had invested their futures in might not have ever legally existed. Others had already begun quietly consulting their own attorneys, uncertain whether their contracts were worth the paper they were printed on. Marlene sensed the shift in loyalty and doubled her efforts, hosting an evening barbecue at the sales office, complete with a live band determined to project an image of stability right up until the moment she was forced into a courtroom. The ownership hearing drew a packed courtroom filled with local press and nearly every buyer who had sunk their savings into Silverbriar Estates. Marlene arrived surrounded by an expensive legal team, presenting herself as a hard-working businesswoman under attack from a greedy, absent heir. Her attorneys argued that Franklin had willingly agreed to sell, that the association had invested millions into infrastructure, that Everett had been absent from the valley for years, and that halting the project would financially devastate dozens of innocent families. They also claimed the map recovered from the pump station could easily have been fabricated after the fact to strengthen Everett's case. Tessa remained entirely unemotional, methodically walking the court through every piece of documented evidence one by one. Nolan confirmed that the seal on the association's map had been copied directly from an unrelated project, pointing out 3 technical errors no legitimate surveyor would ever make. A forensic document examiner testified that Franklin's supposed signature on the sale contract had actually been spliced together from 2 entirely different samples of his handwriting. Hospital records proved Franklin could not possibly have appeared before a notary on the date listed on the contract, and tax receipts confirmed he had continuously paid property taxes on the full 3,700 acres for blank decades. Federal survey data and satellite imagery further confirmed that the boundaries Everett presented matched the actual physical markers found across the property. When Marlene was called to testify, she claimed she had simply followed documents provided to her by Duncan and had no knowledge any of it was fraudulent. Tessa then presented email correspondence between Marlene and Nolan, in which Marlene had explicitly asked him to shift the eastern boundary far enough west to make the lots marketable. Marlene insisted her words had been taken out of context, but Tessa followed immediately with an audio recording Franklin had made 2 years before his death. In the recording, Franklin described how Marlene had once offered him $400,000 to sign off on a falsified boundary map, and when he refused, she threatened to make his ownership records simply disappear within the county system. The courtroom fell completely silent. Marlene, visibly shaken, lashed out and accused Franklin of being a paranoid old man and Everett of exploiting his memory for personal gain. Everett said nothing, sitting perfectly still while the accusation hung in the air. Judge Sloan asked Marlene directly whether she had continued selling lots before or after learning. Franklin objected to the association's claimed ownership, and Marlene struggled to answer. Tessa then presented the first sales contract, dated only 14 days after the threatening email had been sent to Franklin. The judge ruled that Everett had presented more than sufficient evidence to establish original ownership of the valley, formally freezing the entire development and referring the falsified documents directly to state investigators. Almost immediately after the hearing adjourned, Grant received word that Duncan Kroll had failed to appear at his office and was attempting to leave the county with 3 suitcases full of records. Grant and his deputies intercepted Duncan at a gas station just outside town, discovering original stolen deeds, a forged notary seal, altered tax documents, a ledger of payments received from Victor, and a laptop containing dozens of draft, fraudulent deeds still in progress. Grant sat across from Duncan in a small interview room, sliding a cup of vending machine coffee across the table, while the older man stared at his own hands, visibly exhausted from years of maintaining a lie. He no longer had the energy to defend. Duncan admitted the guilt had been building for a long time, that he had told himself early on it was only a temporary favor, a small adjustment to help a struggling development get off the ground. Somewhere along the way, small favors had turned into years of systematic forgery, and he had simply kept telling himself it was too late to stop without destroying his own career and freedom. He looked up at Grant and asked quietly whether Franklin Hale had ever suspected what was happening to his land while he was still alive. Grant didn't answer right away, letting the silence sit heavy in the room before finally telling him that Franklin had known enough to hide the truth where it could never be erased. Duncan immediately demanded a lawyer, but he quickly realized both Marlene and Victor would likely try to pin the entire scheme on him alone. In exchange for a chance at leniency, he agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. He explained that Marlene had noticed Franklin living alone and assumed the valley would eventually pass without a clear or capable heir to defend it. Working with Victor, she had originally created a small legitimate association, covering only the 84 acres they actually owned, then had Duncan digitally alter county maps to make it appear the association controlled the entire valley. The original plan had simply been to use falsified paperwork to pressure Franklin into selling at a fraction of the land's true value. But when he refused every offer, Marlene decided to bypass him entirely and start selling parcels directly to unsuspecting buyers. Duncan confirmed Marlene had always known the association, never legitimately owned the land she was marketing and selling. He handed investigators a recording from an internal meeting in which Marlene was heard saying that by the time anyone checked, the roads would already be built, the money already moved, and no one would have the resources to reverse the project. Once Victor learned Duncan had been arrested, he attempted to wipe his devices and flee the state entirely. Grant obtained a search warrant for Langford Development's offices, where investigators uncovered documents revealing plans to sell an additional 68 lots, which would have pushed the scheme's total projected revenue past $70 million. Marlene called one final association meeting, desperately trying to convince members that Duncan alone was responsible for every falsified document. Many members, however, had already stopped believing her entirely. A former association accountant came forward revealing that Marlene had used shared community funds to purchase her private estate luxury vehicles and multiple expensive vacations over the years. Buyers began demanding their money back immediately, and Marlene claimed the court's asset freeze was solely to blame, insisting Everett was the true cause of their financial losses. Everett arrived at the meeting alongside Tessa and publicly announced he would not pursue trespassing claims against any of the victims, and would instead help them recover funds from the frozen assets tied to the fraud. That single decision instantly destroyed Marlene's last attempt to turn the buyers against him. One buyer stood and asked Marlene directly why she had sold a lot she had never once set foot on herself. Marlene offered no answer at all. Grant then entered the room with a fresh search warrant demanding Marlene surrender her phone, computer, and complete financial records on the spot. When deputies later opened a safe inside the association's private office, they discovered a sealed envelope addressed to Everett Hale. Inside was a detailed plan to use the same falsified deed to seize the stone house shortly after his arrival in the valley. The documents confirmed Marlene had known exactly who Everett was and exactly what he stood to inherit long before he ever crossed the property line. The seized plan revealed her full intentions in disturbing detail. She had planned to accuse Everett of trespassing, generate fake association fines to manufacture an artificial debt file, a lien against the stone house force, a rushed foreclosure auction before he could verify any paperwork, and ultimately repurchase the property through one of her shell companies. This transformed the case from a straightforward property dispute into a calculated conspiracy to steal an inheritance outright. Grant brought Marlene in for formal questioning, and at first she continued shifting blame entirely onto Duncan and Victor. But when investigators played the recording from her private meeting, Marlene realized there was nowhere left to hide. Even then, she insisted everything she had done was ultimately meant to benefit community development. Before deputies led her inside for booking, Everett met her briefly outside the station, and Marlene tried one final angle, suggesting that if he simply agreed to sell the valley now, the buyers could still keep their dream homes. She painted him as the selfish obstacle standing between ordinary families and their future. Everett replied that she had never sold anyone a dream at all. She had only sold property that belonged to someone else, then quietly kept the money for herself. Marlene warned him that 3,700 acres would eventually crush him under taxes, maintenance costs, and endless litigation. Everett revealed something she hadn't accounted for: a private trust. Franklin had quietly established alongside the federal conservation agreement, more than sufficient to protect and maintain the valley for decades to come. Franklin hadn't left Everett a burden at all. He had left him a responsibility that had already been carefully and quietly prepared. Victor was arrested at the airport attempting to board a flight out of the country, while Duncan formally surrendered every remaining record in his possession and pleaded guilty to his role in the scheme. Prosecutors ultimately charged Marlene with large-scale real estate fraud, deed forgery, conspiracy to commit property theft, money laundering, obstruction of justice, destruction of public records, and selling property she never legally owned. She was led out of the association's own office in handcuffs in full view of the very people she had once promised a perfect mountain community. No one cheered. The victims simply stood in silence, watching the woman who had promised them everything be placed into the back of a patrol car. The Silver Briar Estates sign came down that same afternoon. The remaining equipment was sealed as evidence, and every unauthorized structure was flagged for eventual removal. Tessa later handed Everett the court's final written judgment. The entire 3,700 acres officially belonged to Everett Hale, and every deed, contract, and transaction the association had ever created on that land was declared permanently void. Yet Everett still faced one important decision, deciding what would happen to the 36 families who had lost their savings, trusting Marlene's promises. He had every legal right to force every remaining buyer off the property and let them absorb their losses entirely on their own. But Everett understood clearly that these families hadn't stolen anything from him. They had simply trusted paperwork the association and the county land office had both certified as legitimate. He called a community meeting of his own, standing in the same field where Marlene had once hosted her barbecue, and told the assembled families plainly that he intended to make things right, though it would take time and patience from everyone involved. Some buyers were skeptical at first, having been burned once already by a stranger's promises, but Everett's calm, direct manner slowly won over even the most hesitant among them. He answered every question honestly, including the ones with no easy answers, and refused to make guarantees he wasn't certain he could keep. By the end of the evening, most of the families left with something they hadn't felt in months, a genuine sense that someone was finally being straight with them. Working together with Tessa, Everett proposed a full financial recovery plan for every affected buyer. Marlene's seized estate, her vehicles, her investment accounts, and the legitimate 84 acres actually belonging to the original association were all funneled into a dedicated restitution fund. The county's own liability insurance was also forced to contribute, since Duncan had used his official government position to authorize and legitimize forged documents. In the end, most of the victims recovered nearly the entirety of what they had originally invested. Everett chose to permanently preserve the 1,200 protected acres in the north, reopening the old hiking trails and partnering directly with federal conservation officials to restore sections of land damaged by heavy machinery. For the section closest to the main road that had already been cleared, Everett made a deliberate choice not to build another luxury resort in its place. Instead, he founded the Silver Briar Land Trust, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting local water sources, restoring native pine forest, supporting ecological and geological research, assisting other landowners targeted by deed fraud, and maintaining free public access to the valleys. Historical boundary records. Nolan agreed to stay on as the trust's official surveying consultant, while Tessa took charge of a new legal aid program built specifically to help everyday families fight fraudulent property claims. Grant pushed for a full countywide audit of every land record Duncan had ever touched, uncovering several smaller, previously unnoticed cases of similar fraud buried across the region. 1 year later, Marlene's criminal trial concluded. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she was convicted on nearly every charge brought forward by the state. Victor also received a lengthy prison sentence, and was ordered to repay every dollar he had funneled out of the country. Duncan, having cooperated fully with investigators, received a comparatively lighter sentence, but permanently lost his position and his professional license, unable to work in land records or public administration ever again. In the story's final quiet moment, Everett stood on a familiar ridge overlooking the valley below. The extravagant billboards were long gone. The creeks ran freely across open meadow once again. Every fraudulent survey stake had been pulled from the ground and discarded for good. Tessa arrived carrying a restored, professionally framed copy of the original 1912 survey map, and Everett hung it inside the stone house directly above the old wooden desk that had once belonged to Franklin. Beneath the framed map, he placed a small handwritten plaque that read, "Ownership does not belong to whoever shouts the loudest. It belongs to whoever stands on the side of the truth." Everett hadn't won because he was wealthier than Marlene, better connected, or more willing to intimidate people into silence. He had won because he stayed calm, protected every piece of evidence, and refused to let manufactured confidence take the place of the actual facts. The story closes with Everett swinging the valley's main gate shut at dusk, the fading sunlight stretching long shadows across the restored meadow behind him. There is no homeowners association logo bolted to that gate anymore, and no glossy sign advertising lots for sale. There is only a simple, engraved message reading Silver Briar Valley protected forever standing quietly, where a stranger's greed once tried to rewrite the truth of who the land had always truly belonged to.